All right, everyone, we're going to get started. I'm going to introduce myself first. My name is Chris Tepela-Millan. I'm an assistant professor here in the Department of Ethnic Studies and the faculty chair of the Center for Research on Social Change. Before we begin, I want to announce our next event. Hope I don't butcher her name. They just told it to me. And Julie Verma? Okay. No? Okay, I messed it up. She's a Chancellor postdoc scholar or fellow here at UC Berkeley in the Jurisprudence and Social Policy program. And she's going to be giving a talk on March 7th from 4 to 5:30 p.m. here in this room. The title of her talk is quote, "Is decarceration even a word? The legal reform of mass incarceration in California." So that'll be here again March 7th from 4 to 5:30 p.m. in this room. I also just noticed someone in the room that I want to give a special shout out to, soon-to-be UC Riverside professor Katy de los Rios, who's one of Gary's former students. She's an ethnic studies practitioner and scholar, and she's the one that introduced me to this book in Gary's room, so thank you, Katy. Also, I want to ask you all to please turn off your cell phones. And just to remind everybody of the way the event's going to be structured, as our lectures are always structured, we do 45 minutes. Gary will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up to a Q&A. There are seats up here also. All right, so with that said, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Gary Y. Okihiro. He's a professor of international and public affairs and the founding director of the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race at Columbia University. After receiving his PhD in African history from UCLA, Professor Okihiro began his teaching career in and directing of comparative ethnic studies programs at Humboldt State University and then Santa Clara University. He moved then to my alma mater, Cornell University, to develop the Asian American Studies program there, and ultimately on to Columbia University to establish, again, the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race. His career thus includes both public and private institutions as a teacher and administrator on both coasts, and he is one of the founders of the fields of comparative ethnic studies and Asian American studies. His experiences in comparative ethnic studies, his expertise in comparative ethnic studies stresses the ideas of power and its locations and articulations in human society for the dismantling of those hierarchies of race, gender, sexuality, class, and nation, and the advancing of a more equitable and just future. And he is the author of 11 books, the most recent of which is Third World Studies, Theorizing Liberation, which will be outside on sale for sale and for signature, right? So with that said, please join me in welcoming Gary.
Thank you very much, Chris. And hey, is this okay, the distance? And thank you all for coming. It's so wonderful to see a lot of friends and maybe even former friends after I'm done. But it's wonderful to be here. And for the sponsors of my visit, including the Department of Ethnic Studies, African American Studies, and of course this institute, I am really grateful. I didn't really plan to talk for 45 minutes, Chris, because I don't think my brain can manage it. I'm really an old, decrepit professor, and I just cannot sustain critical thinking for more than a minute or two. So I'm also on a phased retirement now in Hawaii, hence my shirt. Really not appropriate or inappropriate for today's weather, especially. It's pretty chilly out there. And I'm just sort of converse with earthworms and the birds and the ohia trees there. So my language might not be up to snuff for this audience. I apologize in advance. Oh my God. Okay, so anyway, I haven't seen some people for years and years and years. So I'm just astonished to see them along with former students like Daniel, who is a star in your comparative literature department, I'm sure, here. Right, Daniel? Sure. Okay. Anyway, so it's a delight. I wasted enough time. So I wanted to just engage with you around this book called Third World Studies, Theorizing Liberation, which is really a series of lectures that I give to this class called Introduction, formerly Comparative Ethnic Studies, and now Third World Studies. So it's a written text from an oral text, and written texts are notes, my written notes, which I deliver from memory, right, Kati? She was a TA in one of those, or several of those classes, right? Which I don't use notes at all. So like I just sort of deliver it, and like that's the rendition of the book. So maybe there's a kind of oral quality to it, which might be disjointed and so forth. But that's the way it is. But what it involves, that is the text and the class, is this astonishing idea, and you guys can correct me, okay? But that this astonishing idea that there is no coherent body of methods and theories that define our field of study called ethnic studies. Is that correct? Or all right. Now that's really astonishing when there is what we call feminist theory, there is queer theory, but we don't have a kind of ethnic studies theory. Now, I recognize that we are sort of multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and so we draw from disparate discourses and so forth, which is an excellent thing, but I think also as a field of study or as a discipline, which I hope we are, we need to have methodologies and theories particular to our field of study. I think we need that. And this is an attempt at that. The other thing about that is that I think, like all human sciences, humanities and social sciences, what we call ethnic studies is the study of humankind broadly. It is not about these so-called racialized minority groups who comprise a small fraction of the US population and imagination. It is about a group of people around the world, humanity's majority, in the words of Ahmad Sukarno. And that's what the students who launched this field allied themselves with peoples of the third world, the oppressed masses. So it is not a puny subject matter. In that sense, it helps to explain the human condition broadly. That's the big ambition. So I'm hoping that the text provides some kind of method and theory, just a kind of beginning, an incipient beginning, that draws from the inspiration of 1968 San Francisco State, when the students formed the Third World Liberation Front, and they proposed or demanded a third world curriculum. That's what they said. And the faculty and administrators gave them ethnic studies. In my opinion, the field was doomed from the start. From that start, the beginning, the misnaming of a field. And that misnaming of the field has consequence today. Third world studies. Third world is a geopolitical alignment, of course, named in the 1950s, 1952, by Albert Sauvé, a French journalist. And it was in the midst of the Cold War, so you had the First World, the West, the Second World, the Soviets, and the Socialist world, and the Third World, the rest, who were the objects of the affection of both the First and Second Worlds. And from Bandung in 1955, members of these newly independent states of Africa and Asia met and moved towards what India called non-alignment. That was an important sort of move on the part of these newly independent countries for self-determination, which is what they had demanded. This subject matter, thus, derives from what Du Bois in 1900 called Hey, I'm lecturing already, huh? The problem of the 20th century. 1900, in London, the seat of the British Empire on which the sun never set, Du Bois, the prophet, declared that this was the problem of the 20th century. He called it the color line. And it was appropriate because imperialism, which predominated for 400 years of this world's existence, up to the 19th century, reached its, what's the height? Is it apogee or? Huh? Apogee, yeah. Huh? Or acme or the height of imperialism in the late 19th century, culminating with Berlin in the 1890s, where European powers divided up Africa. The following century, thus, was the move against imperialism, the movement for decolonization, for self-determination, and anti-racism is what Du Bois pronounced. And that movement was realized after World War II, when largely the states in Asia and Africa gained their independence. Now, the students at San Francisco State named them for that struggle. And they named it with the full understanding about the global significance of their demand at little San Francisco State College. They said, we are rooted within world history. We understand our place and our time. That's a momentous declaration of these students hitching their idea of curricular revolution in the United States to that of third world liberation. So this book is a work, by the way, buy them out there, okay? Once we go out after this, don't forget to buy a copy. Yeah. I have a daughter I have to put through college, and so... No, I don't. Okay, but anyway... Crass materialists in this anti-capitalist discourse of... Huh? Okay. Anyway, Kathy is just shaking her head. Anyway, it is an important subject matter, and it was not realized. It's so interesting to read the documents of the time at San Francisco State, and I just wonder if the transition happened also here at Berkeley, where your third world liberation movement became ethnic studies. How the administrators and faculty referred to black racial groups and non-black ethnic minorities. Right? Race relations for black people, ethnic studies for Chicanos, Asian Americans, and Native Americans. They were deemed to be cultural groups. Ethnic studies from Chicago School of Sociology, against which Michael and Howie wrote The Cult of Ethnicity, Racial Formation. That dominated the field of sociology and social sciences broadly in the US, and I think the faculty and administrators found that an acceptable terminology instead of third world liberation. Imagine that as a field of study today. Actually, students wouldn't even recognize the term third world. But anyway, that misnaming of the field, I think, had a great deal of significance in the focus on culture that became multiculturalism and so forth, in the focus on the process of assimilation described by Robert Park in his race relations cycle of immigration, contact, conflict, and assimilation. In the focus on the United States, because the Chicago School was intent on examining how European immigrants became Americans, how they became integrated within society. It also conformed with the civil rights movement of the time, which asked for integration and civil rights as full citizens of this country. third world studies, I think, follows a very different trajectory. And that is what I was trying to get at. Okay? So, let's engage in a discussion before you all fall asleep. Come on. Come on, engage. Yes?
What do you think of the term global south that feminists use instead of third world?
Yeah. Okay, now that's a really good point, because the naming of geopolitical spaces are really quite important. So Du Bois' color line, right? And the color line was an essential racialization of global peoples. And that racialization was a product of imperialism. That is, prior to imperialism, the European nations comprised of races, each group. French race, German race, English race, and so forth, because of the etymology of the word nation itself, which means birth, which means kinship, which means blood, jus sanguinis, which means race. Those essential, or those national qualities of race in the encounter in the empire became one of whiteness and non-whiteness. I think, 1895, Kaiser Wilhelm II, Gelb Gefahr, the Yellow Peril, painting nations of Europe, the caption said, "Unite to defend your holiest possession," meaning Christianity and civilization. That sort of unity of European countries in the face of a common enemy allowed for a kind of essential white race and essential non-white races. Of course, those were products of the Enlightenment and of the science of taxonomy, which were geographical delineations of the peoples of the earth. But okay, let me not go on about that. Okay, so there's that kind of global division of color, the color line. There's also a division which I propose, and that's between the temperate and tropical zones, because of the discourses that were prominent during the 19th and early 20th century. It conforms more or less to like what we call the third world and the first and second worlds, but not exactly. Wallerstein divided up the world in world systems, so you had core and periphery, those kinds of macro divisions. There are continental divisions and the global south. So I think any particular term has its advantages and disadvantages. It enlightens certain aspects of the kind of relationships. But I think what's crucial or crucially important is to understand that those spatial constructions are social constructions. And as social constructions, they are exhibits of power and power relations. The ability to name, to classify, to rank, and so forth. Yeah. Evelyn.
I was wondering how you treat indigenous people, and particularly in the in the North America, right? How this fits in with your notion of the third world. What occurs to me is that there's lots of ways in which Native Americans, the issue of, or the case of Native Americans displacement, etc., does not actually get captured either in a kind of ethnic studies kind of model or with this third world model. So
I disagree with the latter. Okay? I think ethnic studies model, definitely. Because if you have the nation state as a primary sort of unit of analysis, it elides the colonized peoples within that nation state, and also that the fact that those native peoples move across national borders, sort of like the wall with Mexico, a 700-mile stretch, goes through Indian country, and they're not going to have the wall built there because their people go back and forth across the border. But in any case, I don't think the nation state accounts for that sort of thing. And the idea about sovereignty, for example, for native peoples, is truncated by the nation state. It's abbreviated by it. Because, for example, in 1960, the UN had that Declaration of Indigenous Peoples. Or no, 1960 they allowed for self-determination as a human right. Okay, 1960, after most of the world had been liberated, they said it's a human right. But the Declaration of Rights for Indigenous Peoples, United Nations, in which President Obama agreed in 2010 to subscribe to, subjects indigenous peoples to self-determination, but subject to the nation state in which they live. So it does not allow for the self-determination of indigenous peoples. So the nation state, I think, is a problem. I think third world studies allows for that in its claim for civil rights as not human rights, or I mean human rights and not civil rights within the nation state, a kind of international declaration of human rights. In their appeal, indigenous organizations to the United Nations for, say, cultural preservation, language rights, and so forth. But I think, above all, in the absence of a kind of removal of the world from this sort of hegemon of the nation state, their idea of a fourth world might be more appropriate. The idea of a fourth world is a kind of borderless world without national borders. It's a dream, I know, but I think it can be accommodated within this idea of third world liberation. Yeah, because you see that
decolonization.
Yeah.
In this context of indigenous people.
Right. What is the relation of decolonization within that?
What would decolonization look like
for indigenous peoples?
Yeah.
I would think that it would be their determination of what kind of political form they would want to choose, and also the kind of autonomy they might want to enjoy. They have to decide that for themselves, I would think. I don't know what it would look like. An interesting idea, I think, is that their declaration for sovereignty is, of course, a European idea. It's not an indigenous idea. And it derives from the idea of land and people, the idea of a sovereign estate, which again, I think, contradicts their ideas of a fourth world.
I guess, like if you take the case of, the
right.
Hawaiian sovereignty movement.
Right.
There are arguments about what that would entail, with some people saying basically it would involve everybody other than Native Hawaiians, leaving Hawaii, for example. I mean, because it's land, I guess because it's sort of land-based.
It is.
It strikes me that
right.
The whole decolonization thing is almost sort of defined sort of as outside the possibility, of achieving.
Well, but you're not saying that decolonization is not a progressive move, right?
No, I'm not saying that.
Yeah, because decolonization implies the kind of removal of extraterritorial authority over a people and land, right? That's what colonialism involves. So the removal of that certainly is a move forward. The problem with decolonization was the reversion to nation states, which were borders drawn largely by the imperial powers to begin with, and that led to the incorporation of diverse and sometimes antagonistic groups within a single nation state. So I think that was a retreat from this idea of the third world, you know. Yeah, which is sort of the same thing that happened with ethnic studies, I think. This retreat into cultural nationalisms involved that sort of retreat into nation states or national cultures, you know, which then separates the groups. Sorry, Chris.
So I want to go back to your provocative statement of as soon as the name ethnic studies was adopted, it was doomed, right? And I think you have a really interesting history. Like I didn't know that the term comes from Parks' race relations cycle and all that. I thought that was really interesting. But what do you mean exactly by doomed? And when you say it was doomed in particular, because I'm wondering, I feel sometimes that you're putting a lot of weight on only the name, and I know the importance of the name.
Yeah.
Because oftentimes names could be reappropriated, right? With the word queer, the word Chicano itself, because I still feel ethnic studies as a field has historically been a place where insurgent knowledges have been produced within the university. So what exactly do you mean by doomed, right? Because it's the only field that's being attacked right now by state legislators, right? For elimination.
Really?
Right?
Oh my God.
Like Arizona, for example.
Yeah.
Right? We're not talking about eliminating.
Oh my God,
So what do you mean by exactly doomed, and what's your,
Okay, well, it relates to Evelyn's question about decolonization and the formation of nation states as the means towards what they called self-determination, you know. And self-determination itself is rife with ideas about property, masculinity, about heterosexuality. The nation state is imbued with all those kinds of ideas, right, which you pointed out very nicely in your book. So what happens is that if ethnic studies was grounded within the nation state, it retreats into those kinds of genealogies, intellectual genealogies. Now I know that we need to sort of take step by step and so forth, but the idea of, for example, the idea of cultural nationalism, I think to a large degree derives from Frantz Fanon and his Wretched of the Earth. And this really important chapter on national culture, right? And he gave a talk to a Pan-African group of writers and artists in Rome in 1959, 2 years before his death. And in that lecture, he derided the idea of Pan-Africanism and negritude. He said there's no such thing as Negro culture, you know? There's no such thing as European culture. The only kind of liberatory idea of culture is a national culture. National peoples have to have their history, they have to have their language, they have to have their ideology, their cultures. And that's what he was arguing, right? And that's what the students at San Francisco State and ethnic studies in general took as a kind of template, a national culture. Those national cultures devolved, in my opinion, into those racialized categories that were created by Europeans in the first place, you know? Now, I know that there is liberation in black power. I know there's liberation in brown power. But there's also limits to that liberation, because then it becomes an end in itself instead of a step towards liberation. And I think what happened there is we created these insular silos in which we could only speak for ourselves and about ourselves, and like that presents a problem. You know, I think you should be able to speak for yourself, you know, but also others might have insights into your experience, you know. So I think that's a kind of dead end that was created from that initial idea, you see. Yeah. Now, if we think of third world not as so much as a space, you know, but as Vijay Prashad says, as a project. What Fanon said was to solve Europe's problems, which is a unique way of saying, because race relations discourse conceptualized minority peoples as social problems to be resolved before their smooth assimilation into the mainstream. These are European problems, that is imperialism, racism. The Third World was a project to dismantle those structures of imperialism, which I define more broadly than just the physical material relations, but also the discourses of imperial rule, like I mentioned taxonomies, to dismantle those things. A project, transnational. Huh? Is that cool or no? Huh?
I'm not convinced, but okay.
You're not convinced?
I think these different fields have their own interesting genealogies. Like here at Berkeley, when we have
Okay.
the ethnic studies
Yeah.
department, you have black studies within it,
Right.
Chicano studies
Right.
within it.
Right.
Right. So I think it's a broad claim to say
Right.
it was doomed because these genealogies are really political and certain
okay.
purposes, some of which are transnational from the start, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess.
But what I'm saying, Chris, is not that they're like inevitably doomed or whatever.
Yeah.
What I say is that if that becomes an end in itself, then it becomes a limited project. Okay. That's all. Okay? So in that sense, it doesn't allow for a kind of capacious crossing across those created and imposed borders, you know. Yeah. Right? I don't know. Anyway. Yeah.
Gary, how would you distinguish third world studies from like post-colonial studies?
Right.
In many ways, what you're describing sounds very similar to the way I understand post-colonial studies, focusing on imperialism, capital, subjection, and also post-colonialism as a power relations instead of simply a time period.
Right. I bristle with the idea that post-colonial studies displaced ethnic studies or third world studies. Okay. That's my beginning point, okay? But like, first of all, there's a kind of temporality to post-colonial studies, which then centers colonialism, and that if colonialism is the starting point, then what works against colonialism is post-colonialism. Then one is limited to the arguments made in defense of colonialism, right? These voices from the third world or post-colonial subjects actually are intellectuals in the first and second worlds, you know, who are articulating in this language that might be difficult of access to those very subjects that they purport to speak for. I hope there's some post-colonialists here. You might disavow, you know, what I'm claiming about post-coloniality. So there's a kind of privilege associated with that, while there's this idea of representing the voices of the oppressed and the masses. And then finally, I can't think of it. Yeah. Oh, some of the very categories that they deploy have been effectively deployed also by transnational capital. Mobility, diversity, multiplicity, those kinds of things, which doesn't necessarily negate their power, but it allows for that kind of co-optation, I guess. Michael.
We got a sense here of your critique of ethnic studies and also around post-colonial studies. But sketch, if you will, what a more unified, coherent theory of third world studies is. In other words, what are the core ideas? What are the key concepts? What are the methodologies that are?
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing me to that. Because, you know, any discipline has to define its subject matters and its methods and theories. I think the subject matter are several, but one is power. Power. Power in the physical world is energy. Power in the social world is agency or ability. That's how I define it. Right? Oh, you object to that, huh? So oppression is the curtailment of agency, basically. Right? But the focus is on power. So the locations and articulations of power, however it's deployed. Now I know like the Foucaultian idea about like dispersals and so forth, and I agree with that, but I also reject the idea that one cannot point to power. If you cannot point to power, you cannot point to oppression, you know, and we're all implicated within that relationship and so forth, which becomes an impossible situation for movements against it. The other thing is what the students articulated, and that is the masses. In Gramscian terms, the oppressed, you know, regardless of race, gender, sexuality, class, nation, you know, the oppressed. So the subject matter then, how power oppresses and how to dismantle that. Now, I think Audre Lorde is correct insofar as the master's tools cannot permanently destroy or take apart the master's house, but I think that as I sort of use, in this book, European theory and so forth, to try to dismantle the master's house. And I think it is possible, and I think it is necessary as a first step, not an end in itself. The next step then for third world studies, well, okay, so like, I don't want to, it is self-promotion, okay, but like what I'm trying to articulate is that a kind of theoretical orientation would be around intersectionality or what I call social formation, right? I think Evelyn would agree with that, right, Evelyn? Yeah. You know, at the Women's March on Saturday in New York City, I went to Grand Central, and as I walked on the street, tears came to my eyes because there were masses of people, old people, young people, children, and a multitude of interests, meaning oppression. They were exhibiting and protesting against the various forms of oppression. And MSNBC is the only thing I look on TV for my news, and the Chris Hayes show. Chris Hayes had a reflection on the march, and he had an interesting comment that left. He said, that was an intersectional moment, he said. Now, I don't know if he knew exactly what he meant by intersectionality.
I'm sure he did. He went to Brown.
Yeah, he went to Brown. But nobody else took that up. No, even Chris Hayes himself did not comment about how intersectional theory explains this movement for women, immigrant rights, race, religion, you know, and so forth. It was an amazing display of intersectionality. And I think that kind of ideology can unite people across those divides of race, gender, sexuality, and so forth to form a kind of potent social movement. And that's sort of the idea, to develop a consciousness like in the Freirean sense, and then praxis that accompanies that consciousness. You know. Yes.
So thanks. This is very interesting. I have a question for you, with regard to what you just said.
Yeah.
About how you define a discipline, and to be a discipline, you need an object that can be claimed not by another discipline. Methods and theories. That's kind of the classic 19th century definition of a discipline, which brought us a lot of the classic disciplines.
So it's old-fashioned.
No, but it's not that. Their own claims to scholarly power. And that not only divides between this is this discipline and versus that discipline, but this is a scholarly understanding, scholarly power, as opposed to popular non-scholarly forms of power.
Absolutely.
In other words, bounding off power from the masses. So why would you necessarily want that kind of creation of a disciplinary authority in terms of being able to make a political movement that might question power and move towards liberation?
Now that's a very good question. I'm not interested in creating a kind of discipline in that sense. I see disciplines as disciplines. They try to, they have borders, usually, you know, and that those borders need to be broken down, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah. So in that sense, you're absolutely correct, and I'm mistaken here. Okay? Yeah.
That certainly wasn't
but
my
the second
point
part, no, the
say that
second
you were
part.
mistaken.
Yeah.
But just say why?
No.
Why would you want to?
I don't want that.
Okay.
Yeah. In fact, I shouldn't even have begun with that. I regret that now. And I spoke as a kind of faculty member within the institution to try to get your field of study, accepted, and your curriculum and so forth. And I think that's absolutely correct. It has those kinds of limits. Yeah. But what was your second point, which was really great?
Well, I was just asking a question. Oh, you got it beautifully. Thanks.
No, that's really excellent. Yeah. That's exactly what I'm working against. Yeah. Yeah. At the same time, like our graduate students in like ethnic studies and so forth need some kind of anchor to understand the subject matter and some of the theories that inform our field of study. And that's what I think we also need, as practitioners in the field. We don't understand our own intellectual genealogies, I've told Michael this, that there are a lot of people who use the term racial formation, but they attribute it to any number of things other than what they meant. We're very careless that way, I think in general. And that I think if we were to subject some of our very terminologies to scrutiny, I think we'll be appalled by our deployments of them. So like the idea of sovereignty, for example, coming from Westphalia 1648, defining a spatial boundary and the people and the rules within that as autonomous from other like bodies, is replete with the ideas of race, gender, sexuality, and so forth that we abhor, but yet we deploy that as a means of liberation, And I wonder if sovereignty would lead to liberation. Yeah.
Thanks, Greg.
Daniel.
So my question, I think, comes off of that, which is, I don't exactly know how to put it, but the conversation we were having earlier about indigeneity, colonialism, the ways in which the idea of self-determination might carry these challenging and sort of colonially reifying conceptions of a nation that must be separate from others and exclusive of others and all those things.
Yeah.
It seems like the questions of region, nation, hemisphere, etc. still carry a kind of disciplining method of separation,
right?
That might be problematic, right?
Right.
And I guess my question is about the other direction of that, which is not the stuff that is bigger than the nation, that would be the world or planetary modes. Not that stuff, but actually smaller than that.
Right.
Where do you see third world studies contributing to notions of, if not individuality, right, something like smaller modes of community, or subjectivity that is more rooted in one actor, person, animal, whatever it is, that's a smaller thing from these trans and diasporic all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
I have every sympathy with that. I like to think in small scale, and I think that's the way to begin, in fact, so like, while the beginning might be within these global structures of empire and things like that, I think maybe greater liberation could be achieved through small scale things, as the post-colonial localism, moved. But I think there's a lot of truth to that. Yeah.
I guess, I don't want to belabor the point, but a question I would still have is the notion of self-determination, if we recognize the problems of that self being a certain kind of nationalism, right? Or a certain kind of large-scale political community. Can it be one subject or one actor? Or is that okay?
No,
so why is
right.
that?
Okay. Self-determination again is a problematic term, and because one doesn't self-determine. Like it might be humanism's Cartesian formulation, I think, therefore I am, a kind of humanism that's sort of profoundly anthropocentric. I think, therefore I am. A kind of individuality, which I associate with identity. But subjectivity is a creation of language, and language, I know the problems with Lacan and his phallocentrism and so forth, but the language bestows a particular power but it's a relational thing. It's not an autonomous thing. That is, you cannot, as Saussure argues, right, you can't conceive of anything without language to begin with. And that language is a relational concept. So within the third world structure, self-determination really is in relation, the subject in relation to others. It's relational. And it's contextual, and it moves over time and so forth. So. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for your comments. It brings me back to my graduate studies when we used to talk that way.
You guys were talking like that?
Here's one thing I have a question, your opinion. What I noticed in ethnic studies or reformation of third world studies, it is dominated by a number of disciplinary discourse. Sociology, culture, politics, political structures. What's missing quite often is a sort of a richer, deeper understanding of economic structures.
Yeah, that's true.
And whether you want to be sort of a Marxist, leftist, or some other sort of view of, given the structural changes that's been happening in terms of the concentration of power, economic power, and so forth. What are your thoughts about how that affects your thinking about the nature of the problem of power and how it's manifested, and how it is related to ways of both understanding it and addressing it?
No, that's a very profound question, and my idea of social formation rests upon the means and relations of production. I see that as basic in any social organization. So the idea of social formation is to understand society as Marx sort of saw it, but not as phases over time, or stages, but in its totality, society. And in my way of thinking, my training as an African historian, small-scale societies, from hunting-gathering bands to smaller groups of pastoralists and so forth, help to give rise to ideologies of gender, what we call race or ethnicity, class, and so forth, accumulation, wealth, and so forth. And those, for me, provides the foundations of that social order. I see the others as superstructure.
In a Marxist sense.
Sort of, but not entirely, because I don't believe in the kind of positivism of Marxism, but I see the economy as the basis, and that is where we have largely failed within ethnic studies to analyze, which, Evelyn highlights class and class relations, and, the intersections of that with citizen labor, for example, as she points out, which is a really important idea. So we haven't been attentive to that, but I think that's at our peril. Yeah, we should. Yeah. How would you conceive of the economy anyway? Huh? Yeah? Not Marxist?
Yeah. I mean.
Yeah.
Look. I have my own disciplinary biases. So.
Yeah, but you.
And I'll give you my biases. I may make enemies here.
That's all right.
I think the way within ethnic studies, or if you want to expand it to third world studies, the way that many of my colleagues see the economy and the structure and its dynamics tends to be very naive and outside a sort of robust discipline around economics.
Okay.
What can you do about it? I don't know. I'm just giving a statistic critique.
Okay. What is simplistic, basically? Huh? Simplistic.
Simplistic.
Yeah. Or is this a much more malleable sort of construct?
If you look at, for example, the community of people who are faculty members in ethnic studies, and you do an analysis about their roots, disciplinary roots, I am always struck by not what's there, but what's missing.
Absolutely, yeah. You feel lonely, huh? As an economist.
Yes.
Yeah. Rightly so.
A couple of quick questions. One, in your formulation, where do you locate a place like, and a people like Ireland and the Irish, and their 500, 600, 700 years struggle of anti-colonialism?
Who's that?
Over 800.
The Irish?
Yeah.
Oh, the Irish?
Yes.
What about them? How do I locate them?
Yes, how do you locate them?
Well, variably. I mean, they've changed over time, their relationship. I mean, they're a colonized people, right? And they're also racialized. Their migrant labor into England was a racialized migrant labor, right? And they were denied basic rights and so forth. Likewise, in the U.S., in the 19th century, they were racialized as non-whites.
So do they have a place in third world studies?
Why not?
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, why not?
My other question is
they experience colonialism. They experience, so.
My other question is on the other end of things. In your mention of consciousness related to intersectionality, do you imagine, that's a very materialist formulation. Yeah. Can you imagine that there's a phenomenological or maybe social spiritual transcendent analysis of the that would allow for unification beyond material connection? Right.
I think that is a very promising area. I like to deal with the imaginary. Like C. Wright Mills' sociological imagination is really riveting for me, the idea of this imagination. Alicia Schmidt Camacho wrote a book on migrant imaginaries, which is a kind of liberation. How do migrants have this kind of imaginary as reflected in their songs and their poetry and so forth? It's a marvelous sort of an understanding of that experience. So I think within that's why the idea of the fourth world is an imagined space, but I think it's a kind of wonderful imagination because it doesn't only bespeak human life, you see, it also bespeaks the connections, indigeneity. That is, that people are related to the environment, literally, So on my land, which is given to me by Pele, the volcano, grows her sister, Hiaka, who is the ohia tree. I relate to her as a sister, You treat with respect and dignity all life forms. Inanimate too, but I think that's a wonderful sort of thing to aspire toward.
You can both include and transcend identities.
What's that?
Can it both include and transcend identities?
I would hope so. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And it's part of the kind of relational subjectivity that arises from our recognition that we are not solitary. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Question up front. Oh, yes.
I'd like to make an observation and ask two questions.
Wonderful.
So I arrived here from the Third World in 1984. But the Third World was in Liverpool, England, because there are different relationships of power. Anyway, when I arrived here in 1984, I think there may have been at most 3 PhDs in African American studies, at most. Now there seem to be 15 or 20. And there were probably 3 or 4 PhDs in ethnic studies, maybe not. Now there are 15 or 20. So given that the field in your conceptualization is doomed and moribund, why does it seem to be expanding? What would be your explanation for that? That's number one.
Yes, okay.
But number two is, that's the field within the academy. But seeing also that we're also doomed because of President Trump, what do we do about this broader society in terms of, in the spirit of keep hope alive? And yes, we can. What's your advice?
I'm not a guru. No. All right, but like your first point is important. Sure. The third world and the first.
Well, that's just
no, but it's not just a metaphor. It is a kind of.
And there's more and more third world in the first world. But are the programs expanding?
Okay, but
as an end in itself?
I hope that you understand that.
I'm in African American studies, which I presume is suffering the same.
It's a dead end. Don't pursue it.
No,
that's not what I'm saying.
I want to keep hope alive.
Right.
So I'd like to get out, but I need direction. And I'm living a precarious existence as a third world non-citizen.
You are, especially in
with
Trump's
an Irish
America.
Accent.
I thought it was Liverpudlian.
It is, but most people
Liverpudlian, yes.
Most people here think it's Irish. It's
really?
No one in Ireland would say, but most people.
Oh, I see. No. Well, anyway.
So why is it expanding? What's going on?
Okay. No, the field. I'm talking about the name, the nomenclature. But it's not just the name. The kind of theories or the kind of genealogies from which we derive, given that name. All right. Now, so for example, Robert Park, who was one of the founders or leaders in sociology in the U.S. and Chicago,
was still alive when
he trained. He was.
He
was the secretary, research assistant to Booker T. Washington.
Park.
Yeah,
I studied with Michael Banton in England.
Okay, so you know all about it. Okay, but I bet you didn't know that Booker T. Washington was a devoted student at Hampton College or Institute.
I think I did.
Agricultural. You did?
Yeah,
okay, and the founder of Hampton was Samuel Chapman Armstrong.
That one I didn't know.
Who was the son of a missionary to Hawaii. And this idea of manual education was passed on from Hampton to Tuskegee. Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Compromise, in which you accept Northern dollars for African American training in manual arts, contentment with the hands and not the mind, and Robert Park, who learned race relations through Booker T. Washington. I think that kind of genealogy would sort of suggest that we need to be careful about some of the kinds of terms that we use and models derived from that school. Yeah, that's all I'm saying. But I'm saying that one of the problems...
But I'm worried about impending doom.
The impending doom.
I have a more practical concern.
Yeah.
Called staying alive.
This is an interesting argument, okay? That is two anthropologists, John Kelly and Marnie Kaplan, advanced this idea, and they were looking at Fiji and Fiji nationalism, and it was essentially a critique of Ben Anderson's imagined community. But in that work, they moved to the idea of the nation and the hegemon of the nation state within international politics. And that is that there was a world system of nations or states they maintained following World War II. Now, if liberation was the nation state, then what they argue is that the nation state was subsumed within this rule of like the United Nations. The United Nations is built around the idea of nation states. Those nation states then, through the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and so forth, become the purveyors of that kind of rule, global order. So the nation state functions to subject its own peoples within that global hegemon. So I think that we need to be cautious about foregrounding the nation state in our analyses. Yeah, that's all.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
Okay. So national or cultural nationalism is implicated within that nation state, the idea of the nation state and so forth. So, yeah.
Okay.
Huh? Oh, right next to me.
Yeah, you can't see me. So
sorry.
I think my question, do you want me to hold it?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh. My question would be, I feel like everyone's wondering about doom because doom has come up in two questions because it feels like what really I think you're trying to do is warn against something because is that what's happening?
I'm hyperbolic.
But moving beyond the doom,
I get overexcited and
I do too.
I don't choose my words carefully and
But beyond the doom, like if you're already within the institution or within a discipline that is quote unquote doomed, how do you get out of
You are doomed. You're within the institution. You've got to exceed it.
But how? Like, what are the strategies to even start turning into a third world orientation within the structure that already exists?
Be a third world within Liverpool, you know?
But like, but in the most like, in the most finite way, like you're teaching a course and you want to orient your course in this third world way that is still within the doom, but is maybe dreaming towards a difference. So how do you start to incorporate that? And what I'm hearing, and I like it, is this kind of comparative inner, seeing how oppressions are intertwined and always putting that at the center.
Right. Yeah.
Even within a class that is, structured through cultural nationalism. But I don't know. That's what I'm hearing.
Well, okay. Like any system, oppressive or otherwise, has contradictions within them and spaces, interstitial spaces, and that we can, as people, negotiate within those spaces, I think, and create for ourselves liberatory discourses, which are language and ideology, At the same time, like I'm articulating a colonized tongue, and that has severe limitations. Albert Memmi, one of our sort of textbook reader, the colonized and the colonizer, tells the story about, it's actually his memoir or his autobiography of a Jew, all right? He described growing up a Jew in Tunisia and how his language, he said, was a crippled language. It was a broken language. It was not Hebrew, it was not Arabic, it was a whole bunch of things mixed together. And he said that he felt totally inadequate. I can empathize because I spoke that broken language growing up in Hawaii, called Pidgin English. Then he said he went to the colonizers' schools and learned French. And French was a difficult language. It demanded discipline. But it was so liberating for him to use that language which offered precision and opportunity to engage the wider world beyond his ghetto. Now, one could sort of argue that, but one could also agree with Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who argues that the colonizer's tongue of necessity, if we're thinking about language and the creation of our subject selves, is actually created a colonial mentality. Right? So, on the one hand, I think it can be liberating, those ideas that you might acquire within an institution that might be designed to colonize your minds. At the same time, I think you can use those to work against that project. I think so. Huh? You think?
I hope so.
Yeah, but see, that's only the first step, because the next step is to create languages not of the master's toolkit and ideologies of our creation. That's a really difficult thing to do, but I think that would be the exciting next step for Berkeley's third world department, you know? Yeah. Right, Kathy?
Right.
No? Yeah, absolutely, right?
I have another question stemming from this discussion, and I wonder if we don't romanticize agency too much.
Yeah.
And that's because you started your talk talking about the ghettoization of dark people into ethnic studies.
Right.
But then you said the majority of people in the world are actually people of color.
Right.
But then if you look at the resurgence or the emergence of right-wing or of like right-wing feminism, neoliberal social movements, if you look at Egypt, at Tunisia, Myanmar, aren't we romanticizing a certain idea that we sit here in Berkeley and imbue our subjects with agency, while basically the major theme is be docile, move along. We talk about mobility. Some people don't have money to move from one village to another.
Absolutely.
So what's your take on agential capacities in this kind of third world studies?
Right.
Vis-a-vis the emergence of right wing.
Your skepticism is well founded, and I think that's really important, because there, there's also this idea of hegemony, right? In which Gramsci argues that, and Althusser, that the apparatuses of the state might in fact reach a kind of consensus with the subjects through coercion. But also the subjects themselves might agree to their subjugation, so that agency might not be all that effective or prominent, given that kind of ideal. Now, I think that's true. On the other hand, I think that Gayatri is wrong, that the subaltern can speak, you know. So in that sense, I think the subaltern has agency, which she, I think, correctly denies, given the discourses of the colonizers. Of course, they're not going to engage the colonizer in that language. But Linda Alcoff affords a kind of counter to that in representing others. And I think it's necessary for us to impart that kind of agency to those who are not listened to, not heard. But I agree. I cannot attribute much to resistance. At the same time, I must. Otherwise, there's no reason to struggle. Yeah. On that happy note. Any other question? What are you guys thinking anyway? This man is crazy, or he doesn't, wait. You guys have an opportunity, right? Because I'm talking about the Department of Ethnic Studies. You're in the midst of a kind of consideration of your curriculum and so forth. And I know that we have heavy investments in the classes we teach, and so we'll be reluctant to rethink the entirety. At the same time, I think there can be some tweaks and reform that could be, helpful. Huh? You agree, Locke?
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely.
Oh, really?
One question.
Yeah.
If just building on, I think Michael's question about how you would imagine a third world studies, what are the crucial points?
Right.
Can you think of, on a more tangible level, the kind of projects that we absolutely need to address at this moment? That would be representative of the kind of study that you could imagine in third world studies.
Yeah. Well, I think the moment is rapidly passing us for intersectionality. I think we can capitalize on that now, in this moment, right now, to provide some kind of ideological frame for this disparate and mass movement that seems to have no center and whatever, I think there is a center, and that is how these oppressions are interlocking.
too.
You don't think so?
No, I just wanted to piggyback on that a little bit because I haven't read your entire book, but I've looked at the section on
social formation.
Social formation, okay. Yeah. Which, in a sense, has been a problem in ethnic studies, but also, I think, in the original Third World studies, which did not, in fact, take into account,
absolutely,
sort of gender and other sorts of interactions. So, is that something that you're adding on yourself as a kind of corrective? And how can we? I think, for example, gender and women's studies now has done a better job of incorporating that into our curriculum, and in fact making it kind of central, at least at Berkeley. Whereas I feel like at Berkeley we're really behind the curve here.
What has done a better job?
Gender women's studies. Has done a better job.
Well, your center is a testimony to that.
But I feel like, well, to be honest, I love my ethnic studies colleagues, but I guess some of the women certainly do intersectionality, but I don't think the men do. It's a kind of gendered project. So, I mean, I guess what I'm wondering about is whether you see that as, I mean, that's also part of the legacy of the Third World movement as well, is that ignoring of those...
Patriarchy.
Yeah,
which is nationalism also.
So it's not like it's a perfect legacy.
No. So, like, it is my imaginary that articulates this Third World Studies. And it's because the students never had an opportunity to articulate a curriculum, what they meant by Third World Studies curriculum. I don't think they knew themselves, In fact, some of them chose the name Area Studies, which I find really ironic because of the Cold War implications of Third World Studies and so forth. I mean, Area Studies. So like it's my sort of imagined field of study, and thus it's sort of subject to all of your critical readings and feedback and debate, and not that I'm centering that, but like I would welcome that sort of thing because it is idiosyncratic, I think. Wow. Okay.
So I have a question, which is, so if you were to design this new curriculum called Third World Studies, what would be some of the courses you'd have in it?
What would be some of the courses?
Yeah.
Well, you look at my chapters, okay? Like the nation. I think nation, nationalism, and so forth is an important sort of subject matter. Imperialism. World system, because I wedded to that old idea, but and with it, dependency theory, migrant labor, and those kind of things. But anyway, I think those are like some of the foundational sort of understandings that we must have, and along with the idea of education and subjectivities and so forth,
Yeah, can I ask a follow-up question?
Huh?
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
Which is that I think that the way that our ethnic studies and our programs are currently formed, there's also a sense of there's a community that we serve.
Yeah,
right? And so,
absolutely.
But the kind of sort of capacious vision that you have for Third World Studies, how do you? There seems to be a tension with that, and then also the original vision of ethnic studies, which is a sort of more but accountability to a community and empowering a particular community.
Right.
So how do you have that mixture of the specific and the particular and the universal?
Right. Yeah. Well, I think I'm a little skeptical about the closeness between the academy and the community. I'm also skeptical about that artificial division between it because we interact and are members of various groups. At the same time, also, I think ethnic studies people have not been attentive to some of those organic intellectuals. Like intersectionality comes from, practitioners who experience these multiple and interlocking forms of oppression, and they articulate it as such. But we haven't really theorized it beyond that articulation, which I think is important, right, Evelyn? Yeah.
Yes.
It begs that kind of elaboration, So we haven't been attentive to those organic intellectuals. In fact, look, many of them spoke about domestic colonialism, internal colonialism, long before Robert Blauner and others talked about internal colonialism, you know? So, yeah, I think the Academy need not feel like we are sort of bestowing on the community some of our sort of insights and so forth, but we can also learn from their theorizing, yeah, or should be attentive to those voices, yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to this point about field formation, and I was wondering if, like, instead of starting a field or a called Third World Studies, or renaming ethnic studies Third World Studies, it's not rather we shouldn't rather have a more radical opening up of the disciplinary boundaries, which is what you also hinted at, because I think a lot of the work that you are sort of suggesting should be done is being done, but they're being done in different disciplines, like intersectionality, you know, which is done in women of color feminism, and in queer of color critique, and also the kinds of, you know, the critique that you leveled at ethnic studies and sort of its loss of radical potential because of the way it's being institutionalized. I mean, these critiques are also leveled against African American studies. You know, I'm thinking of Roderick Ferguson's book, or Sylvia Wynter's work, you know, who also is very critical about the loss of radical potential in African American studies. So it seems to me that rather than sort of founding a new discipline and calling it Third World Studies, it would be much more effective or much more useful to sort of find a way to break down disciplinary boundaries so that people sort of, you know, can work together with economists or or with, you know, and I just don't know what's your take on how this could be done sort of pragmatically within the institution? Yeah,
create one. Like I'm the sole member of my Department of Social Formations at Columbia. Yeah, so I created it, and I'm the secretary for the department, and I'm the, you know, if you can just imagine a space, you can name it, you know.
There are multiple ways to get at this issue. One of them is a question, but actually I think it might be more helpful, since it wasn't that long ago that I was a student as an undergraduate in what was then Intro to Comparative Ethnic Studies at Columbia, right, which now is Intro to Third World Studies. What I got out of that class, and actually my entire undergraduate education, especially from your courses, but generally, was actually the lack of a commitment to a lot of these fields that could be seen as corollary to cultural nationalism. And that's interesting. Like I have very few commitments to something like Chicano-Chicana studies, to even Asian American studies, African American studies. And I'm able to be in that position because I'm in an English department that sees itself as being quite separate in a lot of ways from those things. But actually, it is, to me, the comparativity, the comparatism, or a framework of third world studies that I have, that actually it's very interesting, because while it seems quite clear that the particularities of these different subfields, as it were, of ethnic studies need to be understood and not lost, or the particularities of one language, one nation, one ethnicity within something like a pan-Asian framework, or pan-ethnic Asian American studies. You don't want to lose those particularities. But what I would say is that it's the relational or the comparative qualities that I still use, and that I have gotten out of what I would say is your pedagogy, right? So my question, though, is if something like intersectionality, which still carries a lot of the idea of the singular subject behind it, right? One person has a gender identity, a racial identity, or even in the Combahee River Collective formation, like interlocking oppressions are race, gender, class, sexuality. That's different from the comparatism of, you know, all of these different national subjects. And so I wonder if intersection, when it's outside of the subject of one person, so it doesn't fit that framework of necessarily I, as Kimberly Crenshaw, am a practitioner and experienced these things, but like an epistemology or a way of thinking that is not confined to one cultural nationalism or to one kind of community. Is that something that ethnic studies, in your opinion, should also take this opportunity to do? Okay.
The reason for those categories in social formation is that those are the categories deployed to oppress, right? So then you have to articulate those. But the disembodied, categories, to me, is the ultimate, the aim, that we don't have to identify in a particular way or whatever, you know? Those are just creations.
So Gary, okay, sorry. A few more minutes after we're going to pass the time. But before we end, I just want to announce on Monday in the Department of Ethnic Studies conference room, Roderick Ferguson would actually also be talking about the similar topic about the genealogy of ethnic studies, queer studies, women's studies. And that's at what time again? 2:30 in the Department of Ethnic Studies. So joining me and thanking Gary one last time.